He stood by the marble fireplace, the very picture of success in his Tom Ford suit, and delivered the verdict on their 12-year marriage, as if closing a disappointing business deal. "I can't do this anymore, Eleanor," Julian Croft said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Your condition, it's a drain. On me, on my life, on my future." Outside, the California sun bathed their Bel Air estate in gold, but inside, a chilling frost was settling. He was leaving her sick and financially severed with nothing but a prenuptial agreement designed to protect his billion-dollar tech empire. He thought he was closing a chapter. He had no idea he was handing her the entire book. The silence in the Bel Air mansion was a physical entity, as vast and oppressive as the California sky outside. It seeped into the Italian marble floors, clung to the velvet curtains, and pooled in the hollow spaces of Eleanor Vance's heart. Only a year ago, this silence would have been filled with the resonant boom of Julian Croft's laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the curated playlists he insisted on for every occasion. Now it was just the low hum of the sub-zero refrigerator and the frantic, unsteady beat of her own pulse. Their life together had been a meticulously constructed masterpiece of modern success. Julian, the charismatic founder and CEO of Apex Innovations, was the architect. Eleanor had been his beautiful, intelligent, and supportive partner, the perfect hostess, the silent contributor of ideas during late-night brainstorming sessions that he would later present as his own strokes of genius in the boardroom. Their world was one of charity galas at the Getty weekend trips to Napa on a private jet, and a garage that housed a rotating collection of European sports cars. It was a beautiful gilded cage, and for 12 years Eleanor had believed it was a paradise. The first crack in the gilding appeared not as a dramatic fissure, but as a subtle creeping tarnish. It began with a persistent fatigue. She couldn't shake a strange tingling in her fingertips that she initially dismissed as stress. Then came the stumbling, the episodes of vertigo that left the world tilting on its axis, and a brain fog that made her feel like a stranger in her own mind. After months of frustrating appointments and terrifying tests, the diagnosis was delivered by Dr. Anne Holloway in a sterile beige office, a rare and aggressive form of an autoimmune disease. Her body's own defenses were attacking her nervous system. There was no cure, only management, and the prognosis was a slow, unpredictable decline. Julian had been supportive at first, or at least he had played the part. He held her hand during the initial consultations, his handsome face a mask of concern. He hired the best specialist, his checkbook a testament to his devotion. But as the symptoms worsened, as Eleanor had to trade her Jimmy Choos for sensible flats and her vibrant social schedule for long afternoons of exhausting physical therapy, his concern curdled into impatience. His business trips grew more frequent and longer. When he was home, he was distant, his eyes glued to his phone, a small dismissive frown playing on his lips whenever she spoke of her latest symptoms. He started making cruel offhand remarks disguised as jokes. "Careful, Ellie, don't want to trip over your own feet and damage the flooring," he'd say with a thin smile. The shared king-sized bed became a vast cold continent between them. Then came Chloe Sterling. She appeared first as a series of perfectly curated images on Julian's Instagram feed, which he'd started leaving open on his laptop. Chloe was everything. Eleanor was not anymore a 20-something fitness influencer with impossibly white teeth, sun-kissed skin, and the boundless, uncomplicated energy of youth. She was perpetually laughing on a yacht in St. Bart's, sipping cocktails on a rooftop in Singapore, or striking a yoga pose against a dramatic sunset. Julian's likes on her photos were a constant digital heartbeat of his betrayal. Soon, Eleanor started hearing whispers from her dwindling circle of friends about Julian being seen with a stunning young blonde at Spago, or leaving a private club in West Hollywood late at night. The confrontation, when it came, was brutally swift. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor was resting on a chaise lounge by the pool, the sunlight feeling heavy on her weary limbs, when Julian returned home unexpectedly early. He wasn't wearing his usual bespoke suit, but a casual polo shirt and slacks, as if he were heading to the Riviera Country Club for a round of golf. He didn't greet her. He simply stood over her, his shadow falling across her face, blocking the sun. "We need to talk," he said, the words clipped and final. Eleanor sat up, her body tensing. "Julian." "What's wrong? Is it the company?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "The company is fine. It's this. Us." He gestured vaguely around them at the pristine pool, the manicured gardens at her. "This isn't working, Eleanor. I've been unhappy for a long time." "Unhappy?" The word felt absurd. They had everything. "We're going through a difficult time. My health." "Exactly," he cut in, his voice hardening into something sharp and cruel. "Your health. I didn't sign up for this. I built an empire. I need a partner, not a patient. I need someone who can keep up, not someone who collapses." Each word was a physical blow. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs, a painful burning sensation spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with her illness. "So that's it. After 12 years, you're just done." "Because I'm sick. I'm being realistic," he said, his tone shifting to one of cold pragmatism, the same tone he used when firing an underperforming executive. "I've spoken to my lawyer, Gregory Shaw. He'll be in touch with yours. The prenup is ironclad, you know that. We both agreed to it. What's mine is mine." She stared at him, trying to find a trace of the man she had loved, the man who had quoted poetry to her on their first date and held her all night when her mother passed away. He was gone, replaced by this polished, empty stranger. "The house," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Will be listed on Friday. I'm moving into my penthouse downtown. You have 30 days to vacate. I've arranged for a settlement." "It's generous, considering." He named a figure that to a normal person might seem substantial, but in their world was less than he'd spent on his last watch. It was an insult, a dismissal. He turned to leave, his posture straight, his shoulders unburdened. He paused at the glass door leading back into the house. "My assistant will have a car take you wherever you decide to go. Don't try to contact me directly. All communication will be through our lawyers." He slid the door shut, and the click of the lock echoed in the sudden, profound silence. Eleanor was left by the pool, the California sun now feeling mocking in its warmth. The gilded cage had just dissolved around her, leaving her exposed, sick, and alone in the ruins of a life she thought was real. The crumbling had just begun. The 30 days Julian had granted her were a blur of exquisite torture. The mansion, once a symbol of their shared success, transformed into a mausoleum of their marriage. Every object held a memory now tainted and sharp. The baccarat crystal glasses from which they'd toasted their 5th anniversary, the abstract painting in the foyer they'd bought together in a Soho gallery, the grand piano where Julian had once tried to play her favorite Debussy piece, his clumsy attempts making them both collapse in laughter. Now men from a staging company came and wrapped these memories in plastic and cardboard, their professional indifference a cruelty in itself. Eleanor's disease, always sensitive to stress, flared with a vengeance. The fatigue became a leaden cloak she couldn't shrug off. Her legs would buckle without warning, and her hands trembled so much that signing the initial legal papers sent by Gregory Shaw was an ordeal. Julian was true to his word. Her credit cards were declined. The joint bank accounts were frozen. The settlement he'd offered was contingent on her signing a sweeping non-disclosure agreement that would effectively gag her for life. She felt not just abandoned, but erased. Her friends, the glamorous fair-weather wives of Julian's associates, offered initial fluttering calls of sympathy before disappearing back into their busy lives of Pilates classes and charity luncheons. To associate with Eleanor now was to be disloyal to Julian Croft, the king of their social circle. She was a liability, a ghost at the feast. With the sale of the house imminent, Eleanor had to confront the pathetic reality of her situation. She needed to find a small apartment, something she could afford with the pittance Julian was offering. She started packing the few personal items that were truly hers, books from her college literature degree, photographs of her late parents, and a handful of family heirlooms. It was in the back of a dusty walk-in closet behind a stack of forgotten hat boxes that she found it. a worn leather portfolio embossed with the initials W.P., Walter Pendleton, her maternal grandfather. He had been a formidable, almost mythical figure in her childhood. A reclusive financier from Boston, he had disapproved of her mother's choice of husband and had remained a distant, intimidating presence in their lives. Eleanor had met him only a handful of times before he passed away when she was in her early 20s. He was a man of few words and piercing blue eyes who seemed to see right through the facades of others. Her fingers trembled as she untied the leather cord. Inside was not the collection of old stock certificates she expected, but a thick, professionally bound document and a single sealed envelope addressed to her in her grandfather's spidery, archaic script. She sank onto the floor, her back against the wall, and carefully broke the wax seal. The letter was dated just a week after her wedding to Julian. My dearest Eleanor, I offer my belated congratulations on your marriage. I have not been a constant presence in your life, a failing for which I hold some regret. My distance was born of a protective instinct, one you may not understand. I have spent my life evaluating men not by their words or their charm, but by the foundation upon which they build their ambitions. I met your husband, Julian Croft, on 2 occasions prior to your engagement. He is a man of immense drive and charisma. He possesses the vision to build an empire. He also possesses an insatiable hunger and a void where his character should be. Men like him see people as assets or liabilities. I fear that one day he will see you as the latter. It is a grandfather's hope to be wrong. It is an investor's duty to hedge against risk. You believe his company Apex Innovations was started with money from a consortium of angel investors. That is the story he tells. The truth is, the crucial $5 million seed investment, the one that allowed him to build his prototype and attract all subsequent funding, came from me. From a trust I established for this purpose. He does not know the source was me personally. It was handled through a series of shell corporations managed by my oldest and most trusted legal counsel. He thinks it was simply a shrewd, anonymous venture fund. But I insisted on certain covenants. I have enclosed the founding investment agreement. Read it carefully. Or rather, have a lawyer, a very good, very loyal lawyer, who is not afraid of dragons, read it for you. I hope you never have need of this. I hope he proves my judgment flawed and that you have a life of happiness. But if the wolf ever sheds his sheep's clothing, know that your grandfather left you a sword. Yours always, Walter Pendleton. Eleanor's hands shook as she dropped the letter. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The $5 million seed investment, Julian had always told her it was from a group of tech VCs in Palo Alto. It was the cornerstone of his self-made myth. He had built his entire identity on that lie. She picked up the heavy bound document. It was dense with legalese, a labyrinth of clauses and subclauses. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning for anything she could understand. And then on page 42 she saw it. A section heading in bold type Article 9, the Moral Covenant and Beneficiary Proviso. Her eyes jumped to a specific subclause 9.3b, which had a handwritten annotation in the margin from her grandfather, the Pendleton Clause. The language was archaic and precise, but its meaning was as clear as a thunderclap. It stipulated that the initial investment was made on the condition of the investor's faith in the founder's character. And it contained a provision of breathtaking audacity. If Julian Croft, during the course of his marriage to Eleanor Vance Pendleton, were to willfully and maliciously abandon his spouse as defined by an act of deliberate separation and financial desertion during a time of certified medical crisis or incapacitation, then the controlling interest of all shares purchased and held by the original investment trust, a staggering 51% of the company's foundational stock, would have their voting rights and ownership automatically and irrevocably transferred to one Eleanor Vance Pendleton. Eleanor read it again and again. It couldn't be real. It was a fairy tale, a legal deus ex machina. Her reclusive, silent grandfather hadn't just disliked Julian. He had seen the man's soul, anticipated his ultimate betrayal, and laid a trap 12 years in the making. She sat there in the dust-filled silence of the closet, the heavy document in her lap feeling like both a shield and a weapon. Julian hadn't just left her with nothing. If this was real, he had left her with everything. The echo of her grandfather's promise, a promise she never even knew he'd made, had just roared to life. Finding a lawyer who was not afraid of dragons proved to be the first challenge. Eleanor's initial inquiries to several high-profile family law firms in Los Angeles were met with polite but firm rejections. The moment Julian Croft's name was mentioned, a chill entered the conversation. He was a titan of industry, a man with deep pockets and a reputation for crushing his opponents. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of a war with Apex Innovations. Dejected and running out of time and money, Eleanor found herself at a small, unassuming legal aid clinic in a less glamorous part of town. The overworked but kind paralegal listened to her story, his eyes widening slightly at the mention of the names involved. He shook his head. "We can't take on something this big. But there is someone. She's not cheap, but she takes on cases she believes in, and she loves a good fight." He scribbled a name on a piece of paper, Sophia Reyes Escu. Sophia Reyes's office was not in a Century City skyscraper, but in a renovated brick warehouse in the Arts District. The space was modern and minimalist, filled with sharp angles, abstract art, and an air of intense focus. Sophia herself was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, a sleek black bob, and a presence that seemed to take up more space than her petite frame suggested. She listened to Eleanor's story without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Eleanor finished, her voice hoarse with emotion, Sophia leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Croft's attorney is Gregory Shaw," she stated, not as a question. "He's a shark. He's known for burying opponents in paperwork until they suffocate and go broke." "I know it seems impossible," Eleanor said, her voice wavering. "But my grandfather—" The document. She pushed the leather portfolio across the polished concrete desk. Sophia picked it up, her movements precise. For the next hour she read, her brow furrowed in concentration. She read the letter from Walter Pendleton twice. Then she began to dissect the investment agreement, her eyes scanning the dense text with a speed and comprehension that mesmerized Eleanor. At one point she let out a low whistle. A few minutes later, a slow smile spread across her face. When she finally looked up, her eyes were electric. "Eleanor," she said, her voice charged with a newfound energy. "Walter Pendleton wasn't just a financier. He was a legal artist. This document, it's a masterpiece. It's ironclad, old world, and utterly brilliant. So, it's real." "The clause, the Pendleton clause," Sophia said, a note of reverence in her tone. "It's very real. And it's a ticking time bomb right under Julian Croft's throne. He has no idea. The trust it's tied to was structured through a bank in Liechtenstein, routed through a holding company in the Cayman Islands, and administered by a law firm in London that's been around since the 18th century. It's so anonymous, so brilliantly convoluted, he would have never traced it back to a single person, let alone your grandfather." Sophia stood up and began to pace. "Julian committed the one sin your grandfather bet on: arrogance. He was so sure of his own myth, his own power, that he never bothered to have his own lawyers do a deep dive into his seed investor. He just took the money and ran. And he was so sure of his prenup that he believed it made him untouchable." Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar feeling, began to bloom in Eleanor's chest. "So what do we do?" "We don't just file for divorce," Sophia said, her eyes gleaming. "We file a suit for control of his company. We send a formal notice to Gregory Shaw and the board of directors of Apex Innovations. We invoke Article 9, Subclause 9.3b. The legal battle began with a single devastating email. Sophia Reyes sent the notice to Gregory Shaw's office at precisely 9:00 a.m. on a Monday morning. It included a scanned copy of the investment agreement with the Pendleton clause highlighted. The reaction was immediate and dismissive. Gregory Shaw called Sophia personally within the hour, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. Ms. Reyes, this is a desperate and frankly pathetic stunt. Are you serious? Some dusty, unenforceable moral clause from a decade ago? Julian Croft will countersue you and your client for malicious prosecution and drag your names through the mud so thoroughly you'll never work in this town again. Is that a threat, Mr. Shaw? Sophia's voice was calm, almost cheerful. Because it sounds like you haven't actually read the document. It's governed by New York state law, not California, per the agreement's own terms, which has a much longer and more interesting history of enforcing specific performance in trust and estate covenants. And the arbiters of the clause aren't a California court, but the London firm that administers the trust. I've already been in contact with them. They're delightful, very British, and very, very thorough. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Gregory Shaw, for the first time in his career, was speechless. The news hit Julian like a physical shock. He was in the middle of a board meeting presenting a rosy forecast for the next fiscal quarter when his assistant interrupted her face, pale, handing him a tablet with the email from Shaw. He read it, his confident demeanor vanishing. The blood drained from his face. He laughed it off to his board. My ex-wife is having some kind of breakdown. It's a pathetic last-ditch money grab. Our legal team is handling it. But in private, he was furious. He tore into Gregory Shaw over the phone. How did you not know about this? How did my legal team, the most expensive team in the country, miss a clause that gives my sick wife control of my company? It was the seed funding. Julian Shaw retorted, his voice strained. It was 12 years ago. It was vetted, but the language seemed archaic, non-binding. A remnant of an old-world investor's eccentricity. No one ever thought it would be enforceable. The arrogance that Walter Pendleton had identified was now Julian's undoing. He had never considered a world where he wasn't in complete control. He had seen Eleanor as a liability he could easily discard, a line item he could zero out. He never imagined that she was in fact his single largest and most powerful shareholder waiting in the wings. The trap so patiently set had just been sprung. Julian Croft's first move was to attack. Believing the best defense was a brutal, overwhelming offense, he unleashed his formidable PR machine against his own wife. The strategy was simple and cruel: paint Eleanor as a delusional, vindictive woman, scorned and lashing out, manipulating an obscure legal loophole to steal the company her brilliant husband had built. The tabloids and gossip blogs were suddenly filled with anonymous sources close to the couple. They whispered of Eleanor's erratic behavior and emotional instability following her diagnosis. They spun a narrative of a gold digger who, unhappy with a generous multi-million-dollar settlement, was now trying to destroy Julian's life's work out of pure spite. Simultaneously, Julian and Chloe Sterling ramped up their public profile. Their Instagram feeds became a spectacle of opulent defiance. One day they were sipping champagne at the Burj Al Arab in Dubai. The next they were attending a Formula One race in Monaco. Chloe draped in designer clothes and diamonds, her arm possessively linked through Julian's. Every photo was a carefully crafted message. Julian was thriving, powerful, and happy with his new, perfect, healthy partner. Eleanor was the past. Chloe was the future. The public onslaught was agonizing for Eleanor. She stayed in a small rented condo, the blinds drawn, trying to ignore the poison being dripped into the public consciousness. Every headline, every snide comment on a blog felt like a fresh wound. "He's trying to break you before you even get to court," Sophia Reyes told her during one of their daily calls. "He wants you to feel isolated and ashamed so you'll give up. Don't let him. He's playing his game. We're going to play ours." Sophia's game was not played in the tabloids, but in the hallowed wood-paneled halls of justice. She filed an emergency injunction in New York as per the agreement's terms to freeze all voting rights associated with the 51% share block held by the Pendleton Trust. Her argument was clear until the ownership of those shares was legally settled. Julian could not be allowed to use that controlling interest to make any major corporate decisions, such as diluting the stock or selling off key assets to spite Eleanor. The business world, which had initially dismissed the story as a messy divorce, suddenly snapped to attention. This was no longer a domestic squabble. It was a battle for control of a multi-billion-dollar tech giant. The Wall Street Journal and Forbes published lengthy articles detailing the unprecedented nature of the Pendleton Clause. Apex Innovations stock, once a darling of the Nasdaq, began to show signs of volatility. Investors grew nervous. A stable genius at the helm was one thing. A charismatic founder embroiled in a bizarre corporate takeover by his own sick wife was another thing entirely. The first legal hearing for the injunction was a clash of titans. The courtroom was packed with journalists and legal analysts. Julian arrived flanked by a team of 4 lawyers looking confident and immaculate in a dark Brioni suit. Eleanor entered quietly from a side door aided by a simple cane with only Sophia by her side. She looked pale and fragile, but her eyes, when she glanced at Julian, held a steady, unnerving resolve. Gregory Shaw argued passionately that Eleanor's claim was frivolous and that freezing the shares would destabilize the company, harming thousands of employees and shareholders. He painted Julian as the victim of a vindictive plot. Then it was Sophia's turn. She didn't engage in theatrics. She simply and methodically laid out the facts. She presented Eleanor's medical records signed by Dr. Anne Holloway, detailing the severity of her condition. She produced bank statements showing the exact date and time Julian had cut Eleanor off from all joint funds a day after a particularly harrowing visit to her neurologist. She submitted affidavits from the mansion staff who had been dismissed, attesting to Julian's cold indifference in the weeks leading up to the separation. The final piece of evidence was the most damning. Sophia presented a series of text messages subpoenaed from Julian's phone provider. They were from Julian to Chloe Sterling, sent the night he left Eleanor. "It's done," one read. "The dead weight is officially cut loose. The house goes on the market Friday. Time for our new life to begin." Another, in response to a question from Chloe about the divorce, was even more chilling. "The prenup protects everything. She gets next to nothing. Cheaper than her medical bills would have been in the long run. Cold, I know, but it's just business." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Julian's face went white with fury. He had been so arrogant, so sure of his own security, that he had put his callousness in writing. He had just handed Sophia the very definition of willful and malicious abandonment. Across the city, in the sleek headquarters of Apex Innovations, the chief financial officer, Ben Carter, watched a live feed of the proceedings on his computer. Ben had been with Julian from the beginning. He was a quiet, numbers-driven man who had always admired Julian's vision, but had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his personal arrogance. He had seen the original investment documents years ago filed away in a secure digital vault. He'd noted the strange moral clause, but like everyone else had assumed it was legal fluff. Seeing the text messages displayed in court, hearing the cold, calculating cruelty of the man he'd worked with for over a decade, something inside Ben shifted. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a character assassination of a woman he knew to be kind and decent. And it was putting the company he had poured his life into at immense risk. Julian's personal failings were now a direct threat to Apex's stability. The boardroom battlefield had just gained a new silent combatant. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman in her 60s, granted the temporary injunction. The ruling was a bombshell. Julian Croft, the untouchable titan, was stripped of his controlling vote. He was still CEO, still the face of the company, but he was a king in check. The power to make unilateral decisions was gone, frozen until the court could rule on the final ownership of the Pendleton shares. The market's reaction was brutal. Apex Innovations stock plunged 12% in after-hours trading. Worried investors and board members started calling Ben Carter, demanding answers. What was going on? Was Julian in control? Was the company stable? Ben, a man who prized order and predictability, found himself deflecting and reassuring, all the while a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Julian's reaction was a terrifying descent into paranoia and rage. The charming, charismatic visionary vanished, replaced by a tyrant. He stalked the executive floors of Apex Tower, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. He fired a junior analyst for making accidental eye contact in an elevator. He publicly humiliated a senior vice president in a meeting for a minor statistical error in a presentation. He saw conspiracy and betrayal everywhere. His carefully constructed world was cracking, and he was trying to hold it together with fear and intimidation. His relationship with Chloe Sterling also began to fracture. The thrill of being a rebel power couple soured under the harsh glare of public condemnation. The comments on Chloe's social media posts turned from fawning admiration to vicious criticism. She was branded a homewrecker, a gold digger who had latched onto a cruel man. The luxury brands that had once paid her a fortune to promote their products quietly began to distance themselves. This wasn't the glamorous aspirational life she had signed up for. "You have to fix this, Julian," she shrieked at him one evening in his sterile penthouse apartment, throwing a tablet with a scathing Daily Mail article at him. "People are calling me a monster. My agent just dropped me. What do you want me to do, Chloe?" he snarled, pouring himself a large scotch. "This is because of Eleanor. That pathetic conniving." "This is because of you," she retorted. "Those text messages, cheaper than her medical bills. You sound like a villain from a movie. You told me she was fine with the split, that it was mutual. The mask of perfection was gone. Underneath was just a shallow, ambitious woman and a cruel, cornered man." Their romance, built on the shifting sands of wealth and image, was crumbling under the first real storm. Meanwhile, Ben Carter was having a crisis of conscience. He had dedicated 15 years of his life to building Apex. He believed in the company's mission, its products, its people. But he no longer believed in its leader. Julian's recklessness was not just a personal failing. It was a breach of his fiduciary duty to the company and its shareholders. Late one night, working alone in his office, Ben pulled up the company's secure archives. He accessed the original digital file for the Pendleton Trust investment from 12 years ago. He read the clause again, and this time it didn't seem archaic. It seemed like prophecy. He then started digging into Julian's corporate expense accounts and calendars from the months leading up to the separation. What he found made him sick. It was a clear, calculated pattern. Julian had consulted with Gregory Shaw about the financial implications of Eleanor's long-term care 6 months before he left her. He had commissioned a private asset report on Eleanor, confirming she had no significant personal wealth outside of the marriage. He had systematically moved funds from joint accounts into private, untouchable holdings. Most damningly, Ben found an email from Julian to his personal wealth manager, dated 2 months before the split. "Need to begin the process of liquidating shared assets and preparing for a clean break. The long-term health expenditures are projected to be an unacceptable drain on my portfolio. Let's proceed with the contingency plan we discussed." This wasn't a man falling out of love. This was a corporate raider executing a hostile takeover of his own marriage. It was a cold, premeditated financial execution. Ben Carter sat in the silent glow of his monitor for a long time, the damning email displayed on the screen. He could do nothing. He could protect his career, his stock options, his comfortable life, and ride out the storm. Or he could do what was right. He thought of Eleanor, who had always been gracious and kind to him at company events, who had once spent 20 minutes talking to his shy daughter about her love of classic novels. He picked up his personal cell phone, his heart pounding in his chest. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Sophia Reyes's law office, which had been published in a news article. He hesitated for a second, then pressed the call button. Sophia Reyes's office, a professional voice answered. "My name is Ben Carter," he said, his own voice sounding foreign to him. "I'm the CFO of Apex Innovations. I need to speak with Ms. Reyes. It's a matter of utmost urgency. Tell her I have the smoking gun." The final court hearing was not a hearing. It was an immolation. The atmosphere in the New York courtroom was thick with anticipation. Julian Croft arrived looking haggard, the strain of the past few weeks having etched fine lines around his eyes and mouth. The swagger was gone, replaced by a brittle defensive posture. Chloe Sterling was notably absent. Gregory Shaw began, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. He attempted to argue that Julian's text messages were hyperbole written in a moment of private frustration and did not constitute legal proof of malicious intent. He tried to frame the entire affair as a simple marital breakdown, not a conspiracy. It was a weak, flimsy argument, and everyone in the room knew it. Then Sophia Reyes stood. She was calm, her voice measured and clear. "Your Honor," she began, "Mr. Shaw argues that his client's intent cannot be definitively proven. He suggests that Mr. Croft's actions were born of simple emotional fatigue, not calculated financial cruelty. We believe we have evidence that will clarify his motivations beyond any shadow of a doubt." She called her only witness to the stand, Ben Carter. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom and the gallery. The CFO of Apex Innovations, Julian's right-hand man for over a decade, was testifying for the opposition. Julian stared at Ben, his face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. Ben walked steadily to the stand, his gaze fixed forward, refusing to look at his former boss. Under Sophia's gentle but precise questioning, Ben laid out the facts. He described the corporate culture of fear Julian had fostered. He authenticated the series of emails which were now displayed on large screens for the entire court to see. He explained the financial terminology, translating Julian's cold corporate speak into plain, horrifying language. The contingency plan was a plan to abandon his sick wife. The unacceptable drain on his portfolio was the cost of her medical care. Sophia walked him through the timeline, matching the dates of Julian's secret financial maneuvers with the dates of Eleanor's increasingly dire medical appointments. The picture she painted was devastating. A man watching his wife's health decline, not with compassion, but with a calculator tallying up the future costs and deciding she was an investment that no longer provided a return. When Sophia was finished, Gregory Shaw attempted a cross-examination, but his heart wasn't in it. He tried to paint Ben as a disgruntled employee, a traitor looking to seize power. Mr. Carter, Shaw sneered. "Isn't it true? You stand to benefit if Mr. Croft is removed. Perhaps a promotion is in your future." Ben looked directly at the judge, his voice ringing with quiet conviction. "I have worked for 15 years to help build that company. I believe in it. But a company is only as strong as the integrity of its leadership. I am here because I believe the leadership of Apex Innovations has failed. What I stand to gain is a company I can be proud of again. That's all." It was over. The judge needed less than an hour of deliberation. Her ruling was swift and absolute. She found that Julian Croft's actions constituted a clear and undeniable breach of the moral covenant as laid out in the founding investment agreement. The terms of the Pendleton Clause were to be executed immediately. The gavel fell. And with that single sharp sound, the empire Julian Croft had built was no longer his. 51% of Apex Innovations. The controlling interest, the power, the throne itself was now the sole property of Eleanor Vance. The aftermath was a chaotic spectacle of collapse. Julian seemed to shrink inside his expensive suit. As he exited the courthouse, he was bombarded by a storm of camera flashes and shouting reporters. His empire was gone. His reputation was in ashes. A viral video from that day showed him trying to get into his chauffeured car, his face pale and slack with shock, as a protester shouted, "Justice for Eleanor Chloe Sterling's betrayal," was as swift as it was predictable. Within hours of the verdict, every photo of Julian was scrubbed from her Instagram. Her publicist released a statement claiming she had been deeply misled and was a victim of Mr. Croft's deception herself. She was already rebranding, pivoting from tech mogul's girlfriend to a champion of women's empowerment. Days later, a desperate and disheveled Julian managed to get past the security at Eleanor's modest condo building. He cornered her in the hallway as she was returning from a physical therapy session. "Eleanor, please!" he begged, his voice raspy. He reached for her arm and she flinched away, steadying herself with her cane. "You can't do this. It's my company. My life. I built it from nothing. You built it with my grandfather's money," she said, her voice quiet but as hard as steel. You built it on a lie. We can fix this, he pleaded, his eyes wild. I'll give you anything. A bigger settlement. Just give me back control of the board. I was wrong. I was stressed. I wasn't thinking. Eleanor looked at the man before her. He was no longer a titan, no longer the emperor of her old life. He was just a pathetic hollow man begging for the power he had abused. She felt nothing, not hatred, not pity, just a vast emptiness where her love for him used to be. "There's nothing to fix, Julian," she said, her voice steady and final. "You said it yourself. It's just business." She turned, unlocked her door, and walked inside, closing it gently but firmly behind her. She didn't look back as she heard his strangled cry of rage and despair echo down the empty hallway. The view from the CEO's office on the 50th floor of Apex Tower was an exercise in power. The entire sprawling expanse of Los Angeles lay below a glittering, hazy tapestry of ambition and dreams stretching from the distant San Gabriel Mountains to the faint, shimmering line of the Pacific. The cars below were a silent, flowing river of light, the people within them invisible and insignificant. It was a conqueror's view designed to make its occupant feel like a god. For 12 years, this had been Julian's perspective. Now it was Eleanor's. 3 weeks had passed since the court ruling, a whirlwind of legal transfers, press releases, and frantic calls from bewildered investors. The transition had been as swift and decisive as a surgical strike. Eleanor, as the new undisputed majority shareholder, had called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. Her first official act was to table a motion for the immediate removal of Julian Croft as CEO and chairman of the board. It passed unanimously. His few remaining loyalists on the board, men whose fortunes were tied to Julian's, saw the direction the wind was blowing, and with the practiced ease of seasoned sycophants abandoned their former king to pledge fealty to the new queen. Today was her first time in this office, her first time presiding over the company that was now hers to command. She navigated the vast space in a state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair, a concession to her condition, but also, she had decided, a symbol of her new reality. She would not hide her illness. She would make it a part of her strength. The office itself was a shrine to Julian's ego. It was coldly masculine, all dark wood chrome and black leather. A massive, abstract painting dominated one wall, a chaotic splash of red and black that Julian had once boasted cost more than a suburban home. It gave her a headache. She made a mental note to replace it with something serene, perhaps a Monet print. She wheeled herself towards the massive mahogany desk, running her hand along its polished, unblemished surface. This was where he had signed the papers that cut her off, where he had taken the calls from Chloe Sterling, where he had plotted the cold arithmetic of her abandonment. There was no trace of him left save for the faint lingering scent of his expensive citrusy cologne. She felt a flicker of something, not pain, not anymore, but a profound sense of distance, as if she were an archaeologist examining the artifacts of a long-dead, corrupt civilization. She was not the same woman who had hosted his dinner parties and smiled placidly at his side. Her illness had taken much from her physically, but the battle with Julian had forged a core of iron within her soul. She was frail, but she was not weak. The boardroom was tense. The executives and board members, all men except for one woman in marketing, stood awkwardly sipping coffee from porcelain cups, their conversations stilted and low. They were unsure what to expect. They knew Eleanor Vance as the beautiful, quiet wife. They had read the salacious headlines and the court transcripts. Now this woman, a figure of gossip and tragedy, held all of their futures in her hands. Harrison Croft, Julian's older cousin and a longtime board member, held a small court of worried-looking VPs in one corner, his face a mask of condescending skepticism. The doors opened and a hush fell over the room. Eleanor entered her wheelchair, moving almost silently across the plush carpet. At her right hand walked Ben Carter, his expression serious and determined. At her left was Sophia Reyes, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her presence radiating a calm, lethal competence. Eleanor maneuvered her chair to the head of the massive table, the spot Julian had so imperiously occupied. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, and confident. She took a moment, her gaze sweeping across the anxious, expectant faces, meeting the eyes of each person around the table. She saw fear, curiosity, and in Harrison's case, open contempt. She engaged the room's sophisticated microphone system. Her voice, when it came, was soft but perfectly clear, carrying a weight and authority that stunned them into absolute silence. "Good morning," she began. "I know the last few weeks have been a period of uncertainty and upheaval for everyone at Apex. I want to be very clear about the future. The era of leadership defined by ego and personal gain is over. We will be a company defined by innovation, integrity, and responsibility." Her first announcement was met with a collective sharp intake of breath. She officially nominated Ben Carter as the new Chief Executive Officer. Ben has been the stable, ethical core of this company's financial leadership for 15 years. She declared, looking at him with genuine respect. "He has the trust of the employees and the institutional knowledge to guide us forward. I trust him implicitly." The motion was a formality. As majority shareholder, her vote was the only one that mattered, but she put it to the table. After a beat of stunned silence, a round of applause led by the marketing head rippled through the room. Harrison Croft clapped twice, a perfunctory, resentful sound. Then Eleanor unveiled her true vision. Julian Croft built this company to be a monument to himself. She continued, her voice gaining a passionate strength. "We are going to rebuild it to be a force for good. Effective immediately, I am announcing the creation of a new fully funded division within this company, the Vance Foundation." Harrison shifted in his seat. "A foundation, Eleanor. Mrs. Vance," he corrected himself with a sneer. "With all due respect, our fiduciary duty is to our shareholders to maximize profit, not engage in costly philanthropy." Eleanor turned her calm, steady gaze on him. "Thank you for your concern for our shareholders, Harrison. As the majority shareholder, I can assure you my interests are aligned with that duty. And I believe that a company's value is no longer measured solely by its quarterly earnings, but by its social impact. A positive brand identity, it turns out, is very good for the bottom line. But this is about more than that." Her eyes moved back to the rest of the board. 15% of Apex's annual net profits will be directed to this foundation. Its mission will be twofold. First, to aggressively fund cutting-edge medical research with an initial focus on autoimmune and neurological disorders. We will find the brightest minds and give them the resources they need to make the breakthroughs that are so desperately needed. Her gaze swept the room, lingering for a moment on the panoramic window. Second, the Vance Foundation will provide direct financial and legal aid to individuals who have been financially abandoned by their spouses or families due to a chronic illness or disability. We will create a network of support for those who, like me, found themselves facing a medical crisis and a personal one at the very same time. We will give them the resources to fight, to live with dignity, and to be seen not as liabilities, but as human beings. A profound silence fell over the boardroom. This was not standard corporate restructuring. It was a revolution. It was the act of a woman taking the deepest pain of her life and transforming it into a purpose that would help thousands. After the meeting, Ben Carter walked with her back to the corner office. He was beaming. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "what you did in there, it was incredible. You didn't just change the leadership. You gave this company a soul." Eleanor smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. "My grandfather left me a sword," she said softly, echoing the words from his letter. "I just decided to beat it into a plowshare and a shield for others." She stopped her wheelchair by the great glass window, looking down at the city below as the afternoon sun began to dip, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The inheritance she had received was never just about the money or the power. It was about justice. Not the petty, bitter justice of revenge, but the profound restorative justice of turning a weapon meant for harm into an instrument of healing. The emperor had fallen. But from the ruins of his corrupt empire, a new legacy was just beginning to be built. One of compassion, strength, and unwavering grace. She felt the vibration of her phone and saw a text from Dr. Holloway. Watching the news. I'm speechless. And so incredibly proud. You are a warrior. Eleanor typed back a simple, thank you, her heart full. For the first time in a very long time, she felt not like a patient, but like a founder. She was finally building something of her own. Eleanor Vance's story is a powerful reminder that the greatest strength is often forged in the deepest fires of betrayal. She was left with nothing but her name and a debilitating illness, only to discover a hidden legacy of power that her abuser never knew existed. Her journey from a sick, abandoned wife to the compassionate leader of a corporate empire isn't just about revenge. It's about reclamation. She reclaimed her life, her power, and her purpose, transforming her personal pain into a public promise to help others. Her story proves that character is the one asset you can't buy, and that true wealth lies not in what you own, but in what you build for the good of others. If Eleanor's incredible journey from betrayal to triumph moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas. Comment below with your thoughts on Eleanor's final decision. Was it justice, or was it the ultimate form of victory? What happens when your fairy tale life turns into your worst nightmare overnight? For Amelia Hayes, she had it all: a sprawling home in the Hollywood Hills, a loving marriage to billionaire tech mogul Richard Sterling, and their first child on the way. She was living a dream. But one rainy Tuesday, that dream was shattered by a fatal car crash. And as Amelia was drowning in grief, she was about to be drowned by the ultimate betrayal. At the reading of her husband's will, she discovered his entire $500 million fortune wasn't left to her or their unborn child, but to a woman she had never even heard of. This isn't just a story about infidelity. It's a story of a pregnant, widowed wife who, with nothing left to lose, decided to fight back against a ghost, a mistress and a legal system designed to crush her. Stay with us as we uncover the shocking twists and turns of a battle that proves hell hath no fury like a woman scorned and a mother protecting her child. The silence was the worst part. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that had fallen over the 10,000-square-foot Beverly Hills estate. Just 3 days ago, this house had been filled with the resonant baritone of her husband Richard Sterling as he debated stock prices on the phone, the clinking of ice in his evening whiskey, and the soft, hopeful plans they'd make for the nursery in the East Wing. Now the silence was broken only by Amelia Hayes's own ragged breaths and the sympathetic yet useless ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Richard was gone. A rain-slicked stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway, a misjudged corner, and a head-on collision had erased the brilliant, charismatic, and infuriating man she loved from the world. At 34, Amelia was a widow. At 7 months pregnant, she was about to be a single mother. Her hand rested instinctively on the swell of her belly, a gesture that had become her only anchor in a world thrown off its axis. Their son. They'd been so excited. Richard, who had conquered the tech world with his company Nexus Dynamics, had been childlike in his glee, already buying miniature bespoke suits and tiny driving shoes. "He's a Sterling," he'd boom. "He needs to look the part." Amelia had laughed her own background as a successful architect, feeling quaint next to his larger-than-life persona. They had met at a charity gala 5 years ago. She was there overseeing the event design. He was the keynote speaker. He had pursued her with the same relentless focus he applied to a hostile takeover, and she, despite her initial reservations about his flashy lifestyle, had fallen for the sharp mind and surprisingly tender heart beneath the billionaire armor. The first few days after the crash were a blur of condolences, casseroles from neighbors she barely knew, and the hollow-eyed pity of friends. Her sister Chloe had flown in from Chicago and moved into a guest room, becoming a silent, efficient sentinel who managed phone calls and ensured Amelia remembered to eat. The call for the reading of the will came a week after the funeral. It felt brutally fast, a cold administrative necessity trampling on the sacred ground of her grief. Richard's longtime lawyer, a stoic man named Arthur Vance, had requested her presence at his downtown LA office. "Is this really necessary right now?" "Arthur," Amelia had asked, her voice raspy. "It is, Amelia. Richard's estate is complex. There are business provisions in the will that must be addressed immediately to ensure the stability of Nexus Dynamics. I'm very sorry." So she went. Dressed in a simple black maternity dress that felt like a costume, she sat in a leather chair that smelled of old books and money. Arthur's office was on the 40th floor with a panoramic view of a city that now felt alien and hostile. David Chen, Richard's business partner and best friend, was also there, his face pale and drawn. He gave her a weak, apologetic smile. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense room. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read from the document. The legalese washed over Amelia Trust's stock options holding companies. She expected the bulk of it to be a formality. Richard had always been clear, "Everything I have is for you and for him," he'd say, patting her stomach. Their future and their son's future was secure. That was the one cold comfort in this whole tragedy. Arthur read through clauses about a few charitable donations and a generous provision for his aging mother. Then he paused, took a sip of water, and looked at Amelia over the rim of his glasses. His expression was one she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to dread. And now Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, "We come to the residuary estate. This clause, dated 6 months ago, supersedes all previous versions." He took a deep breath. "I, Richard Sterling, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my remaining personal and professional assets, including all properties, liquid capital, and my controlling shares in Nexus Dynamics, to Ms. Isabella Rossi." The name hung in the air, a foreign object with no meaning. Isabella Rossi. Amelia looked at Arthur, expecting a correction. A typo. A joke in the worst possible taste. "I'm sorry," Amelia said, a faint, nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Who?" David Chen flinched beside her, looking down at his clasped hands as if they held the secrets of the universe. That was the first alarm bell. David knew the name. Arthur Vance's face was grim. "Isabella Rossi," he repeated as if speaking to a child. He pushed a smaller document across the polished mahogany desk. It was a single sheet of paper with a name and address in Soho, New York, and a social security number. Amelia's mind was a frantic, buzzing blank. She searched her memory for any mention of this woman. A business associate? A distant cousin? Nothing. The name was a void. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There must be a mistake. Our son? What about our son Richard would never—" Arthur's gaze softened, but his words were like shards of glass. "Amelia, the will is legally ironclad. It was signed, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and notarized. Richard was declared to be of sound mind. According to this document, his entire fortune, estimated at over $500 million, belongs to Ms. Rossi." The room began to spin. The panoramic view of the city tilted violently. $500 million. Everything. The house she was living in. The money for her baby's future. The company Richard had built from nothing. All of it was gone, handed to a stranger. A cold, creeping dread, far worse than grief, began to seep into her bones. Grief was the pain of loss. This was the horror of erasure. It was as if her entire 5-year marriage, the life they had built, the child she was carrying, had been wiped away by a signature on a piece of paper. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her eyes locked on David Chen. "David," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Who is she?" David couldn't meet her gaze. He just shook his head, his silence a deafening confession. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Richard hadn't just died. He had systematically, secretly, and deliberately disinherited her and their unborn child. And his best friend had known. The silence that had haunted her home for a week suddenly had a name. It was the sound of a secret life, a life that had just detonated her own. The storm of grief was over. The war was just beginning. The drive back to Beverly Hills was a silent movie of Amelia's life crumbling. The sun-drenched palms and designer storefronts of Rodeo Drive seemed to mock her artifacts from a life that was no longer hers. Chloe was waiting on the marble steps of the house, Isabella Rossi's house. A cruel voice in her head corrected, and knew from one look at Amelia's face that something was terribly wrong. Inside the story tumbled out a torrent of disbelief and pain. Chloe listened, her expression hardening from sympathy to outrage. A mistake. It has to be a mistake, Chloe insisted, pacing the vast living room. Blackmail, coercion. There's no way Richard would do this. But Amelia had seen David Chen's face. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was no mistake. It was a choice, a deliberate, calculated demolition of their life together. That night's sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her mind, an architect's mind trained to see blueprints and structures, was now obsessed with deconstructing her husband's secret life. Armed with a glass of milk and Richard's laptop, which his assistant had dropped off, she began to dig. His password was, with a sickening irony, their anniversary, 0514. For a moment she felt a flicker of hope. A man who used their anniversary as a password couldn't be a monster. The hope died a quick and brutal death. There was nothing obvious in his primary email account. It was all business, Nexus Dynamics board meetings, and a few emails to her with flight confirmations for their baby moon to Italy, a trip they would never take. But Richard was a creature of habit and redundancy. He had backups for his backups. Amelia found a link to a cloud storage account buried in a subfolder labeled Personal Ventures. The password for this was different. She tried his birthday, his mother's birthday, the company's founding date. Nothing. On a whim, her fingers typed Isabella. Access granted. The contents of the folder were a digital stab to the heart. It wasn't just an affair. It was a parallel life. There were hundreds of photos. Richard and a stunningly beautiful woman with raven black hair and piercing green eyes. They were in Paris, laughing under the Eiffel Tower. On a yacht in Monaco, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. In a cozy New York apartment decorated with expensive modern art, looking every bit the established couple. This was Isabella Rossi. The dates on the photos stretched back 3 years. 3 years of lies. He had been with this woman a year before he'd even proposed to Amelia. He had proposed to her, looked her in the eyes, and promised her forever, all while living this other life. Then she found the financial records. A folder simply labeled IR contained a litany of devastation. A wire transfer for $2.5 million, the down payment for an art gallery in Soho. Monthly credit card statements for a card Amelia never knew existed, with charges from Cartier, Chanel, and five-star hotels around the world. He hadn't just been having an affair. He had been funding an entire existence for this woman. The final document was a PDF scan, a preliminary draft of the will she'd heard read just hours ago. The date on it was from 8 months back, just a week after Amelia had tearfully told him she was pregnant. The timing was a calculated cruelty that made her physically ill. He had learned he was going to be a father, and in response, he had written his son out of his life. The next morning, Amelia wasn't just grieving. She was cold with a fury so profound it felt like a new source of energy. Grief made you weak. Rage made you focused. She called David Chen. "We need to talk," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "My house. 1 hour." He arrived looking like he hadn't slept. He stood awkwardly in the foyer, refusing to sit. "Why, David?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Why didn't you tell me?" He finally looked at her. His eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and pity. "I didn't know the extent of it, Amelia. I swear. I knew about Isabella. Richard called her his escape. He said things with you were perfect, almost too perfect. He felt he couldn't be his real messy self. He said Isabella. She understood his demons. His demons! Amelia's voice dripped with scorn. His demons drove a Porsche and shopped on Fifth Avenue. He was going to tell you, David stammered. After the baby was born, he was torn. He loved you, Amelia. He really did. But he was addicted to her, to the life he had with her. The will. I had no idea about the will. That's a shock to me, too. It's insane. It's not the Richard I knew. The Richard you knew was a liar, she stated flatly. And you enabled him. She dismissed him with a wave of her hand, the friendship they had shared now just another piece of wreckage. Her path was clear. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about justice. It was about the fact that Richard's son would not be born into a world where his own father had declared him worthless. She remembered the lawyer who had handled her prenuptial agreement with Richard, a savvy, no-nonsense woman who had warned her in a gentle but firm way about the power imbalances in the relationship. A woman Richard had dismissed as an overly aggressive shark. That was exactly the kind of shark Amelia needed now. She found the card in her old file cabinet. Eleanor Vance and Associates, specializing in high-stakes family law and estate litigation. Arthur Vance's daughter. The irony was not lost on her. When she called, she got Eleanor's assistant. Ms. Vance is booked for the next 3 months. Tell her it's Amelia Hayes. The widow of Richard Sterling. Amelia said, a new hardness in her tone. Tell her I'm about to be evicted from my home by a ghost, and I'm 7 months pregnant with a disinherited baby. I'm quite sure she'll find the time. Eleanor Vance called back in 10 minutes. The meeting was set for the next day. As Amelia hung up the phone, she walked over to the grand window overlooking the perfectly manicured gardens. The gardeners were still tending to the roses Richard had planted for her. Soon they would be taking orders from Isabella Rossi. Amelia placed a hand on her belly. He won't erase you, she whispered to the life growing inside her. I won't let him. Eleanor Vance's office was the antithesis of her father's. Where Arthur's was old-world wood-paneled and masculine, Eleanor's was stark modern and radiating sharp feminine power. Glass walls, chrome furniture, and a single dramatic orchid on a white desk. Eleanor herself was in her early 40s with a severe blonde bob and eyes that seemed to analyze, categorize, and dismiss you all in the space of a single handshake. Amelia laid out the story, pushing the printouts from Richard's secret cloud account across the desk. The photos, the bank statements, the draft of the will. She spoke with a detached clinical precision, having walled off her emotions for the sake of clarity. Eleanor listened without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin. When Amelia was finished, she was silent for a full minute. Your husband was a very methodical man, Eleanor said finally, her voice crisp. And a very thorough bastard, forgive my French. Can I fight this? Amelia asked, the question hanging in the air. You can always fight, Eleanor corrected. The question is, can you win? On the surface, the will is sound. He was of age, he signed it, it was witnessed. His mental state would be the primary angle of attack. We would have to prove one of two things. Either he lacked testamentary capacity, meaning he was not of sound mind when he signed it, or he was under undue influence. He wasn't insane, Eleanor. He was running a multi-billion-dollar company. I'm not talking about insanity, Eleanor clarified, leaning forward. I'm talking about a state of mind so compromised that he was not acting of his own free will. Was he ill? On any heavy medication. Showing signs of cognitive decline. Amelia thought back. In the last year, Richard had been more volatile, more secretive. He'd had bouts of intense paranoia about corporate espionage and had been drinking more heavily, but enough to invalidate a will. It seemed like a stretch. That leaves undue influence, Eleanor continued. We have to prove that this Isabella Rossi exerted a level of psychological control over him that essentially subverted his own intentions and replaced them with hers. We have to paint her as a predator, a manipulator who isolated him and coerced him into this decision. She's the one he left his entire fortune to, abandoning his pregnant wife. Doesn't that speak for itself? Amelia asked, a note of frustration in her voice. To you, yes. To a judge, it's just a man changing his mind. Rich, powerful men have mistresses. It's a tale as old as time. The courts are unsympathetic unless we can prove malicious predatory intent. A letter arrived 2 days later. It was from a prestigious law firm, Thorne & Associates, representing the executor of the estate of Richard Sterling and its sole beneficiary, Ms. Isabella Rossi. It was a formal notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. Tucked inside was a second envelope. This one was personal, handwritten on thick, cream-colored cardstock. Dear Amelia, the note began, the handwriting in elegant looping script. I cannot begin to imagine the pain you are feeling right now. I know this must be a terrible shock. Richard spoke of you with great respect, and he never intended to cause you hurt. What he and I shared was something separate, something he felt he needed. He was a complex man, and he made this decision for reasons I hope you can one day understand. To that end, my lawyers have drafted a settlement offer. It is my hope that this will provide for you and the child and allow us all to move on without a painful and public conflict. I wish you nothing but the best. Sincerely, Isabella Rossi. The attached settlement offered a one-time payment of $5 million. In exchange, Amelia would waive all future claims to the estate and agree to a non-disclosure agreement. $5 million, Amelia spat, tossing the letter onto Eleanor's desk. It's a rounding error for an estate this size. It's an insult. It's not an insult, Amelia. It's a strategic move, Eleanor countered, picking up the letter. It's a very smart one, actually. It paints her as reasonable, even generous. If we refuse and go to court, her lawyers will use this. They'll say, we tried to provide for the grieving widow, Your Honor, but she was greedy. She wanted it all. This is her first move in the chess game. So what's our move? We file an immediate challenge to the will. We file for an injunction to stop the eviction and freeze the estate's assets. And Eleanor paused, her eyes gleaming. We arrange a meeting. I want to see this woman. I want to look her in the eye and see who we are dealing with. The meeting took place a week later in a neutral location, a private conference room at a luxury hotel. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked in. Eleanor was a calming presence beside her, radiating an icy confidence. Isabella Rossi was already seated. She was even more beautiful in person than in the photographs. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored navy blue dress with her dark hair pulled back in a chic chignon, she looked less like a homewrecker and more like a CEO. Beside her sat her lawyer, a slick, silver-haired man named Marcus Thorne, who had the predatory smile of a shark. Isabella stood as they entered, her expression one of deep, practiced sorrow. Amelia, she said, her voice soft and cultured. Thank you for coming. I am so terribly sorry for your loss. For our loss. The hour was a deliberate, calculated jab. Amelia felt a hot flash of rage but kept her expression neutral, just as Eleanor had coached her. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Eleanor said, taking a seat. My client has received your offer. We are rejecting it, Marcus Thorne chuckled. Ms. Vance, with all due respect, on what grounds you have a legally binding will and testament? Your client has a prenuptial agreement that, while generous, doesn't entitle her to the primary estate. Your case is based on emotion, not law. My case is based on the fact that Mr. Sterling, a man who was famously devoted to building a legacy, inexplicably disinherited his only son and heir. Just weeks after learning of his existence, Eleanor shot back. We find that highly suspect. We find it indicative of undue influence. Isabella finally spoke, her gaze fixed on Amelia. Her green eyes were filled with what looked like genuine empathy, a performance so convincing it was terrifying. This wasn't about money, Amelia. Richard felt trapped. He felt he was playing a role with you, the perfect husband, the perfect father-to-be. With me, he could just be himself. He left me his fortune because he knew I understood his true legacy, his soul. It was a testament to our connection, not an attack on you. Every word was a perfectly crafted insult painting Amelia as a naive placeholder in Richard's real life. His soul, Amelia said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts. You knew he had a wife. You knew he had a child on the way. And you took everything. You call that understanding his soul, I call it a heist. Isabella's mask of sympathy flickered for a brief second. A flicker of something cold and hard flashed in her eyes before she replaced it with a wounded look. I'm sorry you see it that way, she murmured. We were trying to handle this with dignity. Dignity, Marcus Thorne interjected, closing his briefcase with a sharp snap, is accepting the generous offer on the table. The alternative is a very public, very ugly court battle where your and Mr. Sterling's private lives will be dissected in excruciating detail. I have to ask you, Ms. Hayes, is that something you want to put yourself and your unborn child through? I suggest you reconsider. It was a threat cloaked in legal concern. They were banking on her being too pregnant, too grieving, and too intimidated to fight. They were counting on her to take the money and disappear. As they walked out of the hotel, Amelia felt a tremor of fear. Thorne was right. A court battle would be brutal. They would try to tear her apart on the stand. She's good, Eleanor said, her voice grim as they waited for the valet. She's playing the part of the tragic soulmate perfectly. Thorne is a viper. They think they have this won. Do they? Amelia asked, her voice small. Eleanor looked at her, a fierce light in her eyes. They have a signed document. We have a story of a predatory mistress and a compromised man. Right now it's a coin toss. Our job is to find the evidence that proves our story is the true one. We need to dig into Isabella Rossi's life. We need to find out who she really was before she became Richard's soulmate. Because women like that, they almost always have a past. The battle for the estate began not in a courtroom, but in the shadowy world of private investigation. While Eleanor's legal team filed motions and injunctions buying Amelia precious time in her home, a man named Frank Miller was tasked with excavating Isabella Rossi's life. Frank was a former NYPD detective with a bloodhound's nose for secrets and a demeanor that could coax stories out of stones. His first reports were frustratingly thin. Isabella Rossi, 38, had no criminal record. She'd immigrated from Italy with her family as a child. She had a degree in art history from Columbia University. For years, she worked at various high-end galleries in Manhattan before opening her own Galleria Rossi in Soho, the one Richard had funded. On paper, she was the embodiment of the American dream, a smart, cultured, self-made woman. She's clean, Eleanor, Frank reported a week into the investigation. Her financials were a little shaky before she met Sterling, some credit card debt and a business loan she was struggling with, but nothing that screams master criminal. She's just lucky, I guess. No one's that lucky, Frank, Eleanor insisted. Keep digging. Talk to people. Ex-boyfriends, former colleagues, estranged family. Someone knows something. Meanwhile, Amelia was engaged in her own form of archaeology, sifting through the remnants of her marriage. She went through Richard's old journals, his photo albums, his correspondence, looking for any sign of the man who could do this. She found notes about his insecurities, his fear of not living up to his own father's legacy, a profound loneliness that success seemed to amplify rather than cure. It was the messy self David Chen had talked about. Isabella hadn't created these vulnerabilities. She had found them and exploited them. The first crack in Isabella's pristine facade came from an unexpected source. Frank tracked down a disgruntled former curator from Galleria Rossi, a woman named Clara who had been fired 6 months prior. Clara was initially hesitant to talk, bound by an NDA, but Frank's particular brand of persuasive charm and the implication that her silence could be seen as complicity in a major fraud case loosened her tongue. Isabella is a chameleon, Clara said, nursing a coffee in a dingy Brooklyn diner. She becomes whatever the person across from her wants her to be, especially if that person is a man with a 9-figure net worth. Richard Sterling wasn't her first. The air in the diner suddenly felt charged. "What do you mean?" Frank pressed. "About 5 years before she met Richard, there was another one, a real estate tycoon named Julian Croft. Older, recently divorced, incredibly wealthy. She met him at a Christie's auction. Within 6 months she was living in his Park Avenue penthouse. He doted on her, bought her art, introduced her to everyone. She was his entire world." "What happened to him?" Frank asked. Clara leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He died. A heart attack, they said. He was in his late 60s, so no one looked twice. But it was sudden. He'd just had a full physical and been given a clean bill of health. And the timing was convenient." Frank's pulse quickened. "Convenient how?" "He'd just added her to his will. Not for everything like with Sterling, but for a modest sum, $10 million. Enough for her to leave the gallery she was at and start planning for her own. But the money got tied up in a fight with his kids. By the time she got it, most of it was gone to legal fees. She learned a lesson from that, I think. She learned to aim for the whole damn thing and make it ironclad. This was it, a pattern of behavior. It was the leverage they needed to argue that Isabella wasn't a passive lover, but an active predator with a history." Frank spent the next week digging into the life and death of Julian Croft. The official cause of death was a massive coronary thrombosis. There was no autopsy performed, as his family doctor signed the death certificate. It was a dead end, but a tantalizing one. It might not be admissible in court, but it told them exactly who Isabella was. Back in Los Angeles, Amelia received an unwelcome visitor. Margaret Sterling, Richard's mother, appeared at her doorstep unannounced. Margaret was a formidable woman, an old money matriarch, who had always treated Amelia with a polite but cool distance. She believed Amelia was a perfectly suitable wife, but not the society-bred woman she had envisioned for her brilliant son. "Amelia," she said, her tone brisk as she stepped into the foyer, "we need to talk about this circus you are creating." She sat in the formal living room, refusing any offer of tea or water. "I have read the letters from Richard's lawyers. I have read about your lawsuit. You are dragging the Sterling name through the mud. Richard made his wishes clear. For you to contest them is unseemly." Amelia, her belly now a prominent curve under her sweater, felt a surge of defiance. "Unseemly? Your son disinherited his own child, Margaret. He left everything he had to a woman he was having an affair with for 3 years, and you are worried about appearances." "Richard was a complicated man," Margaret said, her voice unwavering. "He clearly felt a profound connection with this woman. Perhaps she understood him in a way you did not. He made a choice. Your choice now is to accept it with grace, or to create a public spectacle that will only tarnish his memory and hurt your child in the long run." The conversation was a brutal reminder of the world they were up against. A world where a man's last wishes, no matter how cruel, were seen as sacrosanct, and the woman left behind was expected to grieve quietly and accept her fate. Margaret saw Isabella not as a threat, but as the fulfillment of a romantic if tragic narrative. "I am not tarnishing his memory," Amelia said, her voice low and steady. "I am protecting his son. The son you are apparently willing to see cast aside. This is my house, Margaret. If you've come here to tell me to give up, you can leave." The encounter left Amelia shaken but also strangely resolved. The battle lines were clearer than ever. On one side was money, power, and a carefully constructed narrative. On her side was the simple, undeniable truth of a mother's instinct. A few days later, Eleanor called with news. "Frank found something. It's not the smoking gun, but it's a very interesting bullet. Remember Clara, the ex-curator? She kept some things from her time at the gallery. Voicemails she saved to protect herself after Isabella fired her." "And," Amelia pressed, her heart pounding, "there's one in particular. It's a message Isabella left for a friend in Italy right after Julian Croft died. She's upset, but not because she's grieving. She's furious that his kids are challenging the will. Listen to this line, Frank transcribed it for me. He promised me security, the old fool. I played my part perfectly for 2 years, and his greedy children want to steal it away. I won't make that mistake again. Next time I'll make sure it's all locked down before the idiot even gets a cold. Amelia sank into a chair, the words echoing in the silent room. I won't make that mistake again. Richard hadn't just been a lover. He had been her second chance, her do-over, her masterpiece of manipulation. Is it enough? Amelia whispered. It's enough to get us in the ring. Eleanor's voice was grimly determined. It proves intent. It proves a pattern. Now we just have to convince a judge that Richard Sterling wasn't a man in love. He was the next idiot in her collection. The Superior Court of California County of Los Angeles was an imposing building, a modern temple of justice where lives were dismantled and rebuilt daily. As Amelia walked up the steps 7.5 months pregnant, she felt 1,000 eyes on her. The story had been leaked to the press, and the media had descended like vultures. "Billionaire's secret will," screamed one headline. "Pregnant widow versus the other woman," read another. They had turned her tragedy into a salacious soap opera. Inside courtroom 14B was packed. On one side, Amelia sat with Eleanor, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed forward. On the other, Isabella and Marcus Thorne were a picture of cool confidence. Isabella was dressed in a conservative charcoal suit, her expression one of pained reluctance, as if this whole affair was a distasteful duty she was forced to endure. The trial began with opening statements. Marcus Thorne went first. He was a master orator, his voice resonating through the courtroom. He painted a picture of Richard Sterling as a tortured genius, a man who had the world at his feet but felt profoundly alone. He described Amelia as a good wife, but one who was part of the gilded cage Richard longed to escape. And then he met Isabella Rossi, Thorne declared, gesturing towards his client. A woman who saw not the billionaire but the man, an intellectual equal, a kindred spirit. Their love was not a sordid affair, ladies and gentlemen. It was a meeting of souls. Richard Sterling's final will was not an act of malice. It was his final act of love, a testament to the woman who truly knew him. Ms. Hayes's prenuptial agreement provided for her generously. This lawsuit is not born of need. It is born of greed and spite. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She walked slowly to the lectern, her presence commanding a different kind of attention, not theatrical, but intensely focused. "Marcus Thorne would have you believe this is a love story," she began, her voice calm and clear. "It is not. This is a story of predation. It is the story of a calculating woman who targeted a vulnerable married man. A woman with a history of seducing wealthy men for financial gain. A woman who, by her own admission, sees men not as partners, but as opportunities. We will prove that Isabella Rossi systematically isolated Richard Sterling from his wife and business partner, that she fed his insecurities, and that she poisoned his mind until he signed a document that betrayed the single most important legacy any man can leave his own child. This was not an act of love. It was the final move in a long and calculated con. The first few days of the trial were a brutal parade of witnesses. David Chen was called to the stand. Thorne's cross-examination was merciless. He forced David to admit that Richard had complained about his marriage, that he had felt pressured by the impending fatherhood, and that he had described his time with Isabella as the only time he felt truly alive. Each admission felt like a fresh betrayal to Amelia. When Eleanor questioned David, she focused on Richard's behavior in his final months. "Mr. Chen, did you notice a change in Richard's business practices after Ms. Rossi became a more permanent fixture in his life?" "Yes," David admitted reluctantly. "He became more impulsive. He made a couple of risky acquisitions against the board's advice. He seemed distracted, paranoid. He installed security software on all our systems because he was convinced a competitor was trying to steal his ideas." "And who recommended that software?" Eleanor asked. Isabella, David said, his voice barely a whisper. She introduced him to the company. Next came Richard's executive assistant, a nervous young woman named Sarah. She testified that in the last year Miss Rossi had become the gatekeeper to Richard. Calls were routed through her and meetings were scheduled or canceled based on her approval. He called her his strategic advisor, Sarah said, but it felt more like she was his handler. The turning point came when Eleanor called Clara, the former gallery curator, to the stand. Thorne immediately objected, arguing her testimony about Julian Croft was irrelevant and prejudicial. After a heated bench conference, the judge allowed it, but with a strict warning to the jury to consider it only as potential evidence of a pattern, not as proof of wrongdoing in this specific case. Clara recounted the story of Julian Croft, his sudden death in the will. Then Eleanor played the voicemail. Isabella's voice, younger but unmistakably hers, filled the courtroom, dripping with venom. "I won't make that mistake again. Next time I'll make sure it's all locked down before the idiot even gets a cold." A shocked murmur rippled through the gallery. Isabella's composure finally broke. Her face went white with fury, and she shot a venomous glare at the witness stand. For the first time, the jury saw the predator beneath the poise. But the final and most feared part of the trial was Amelia's own testimony. Marcus Thorne would get to cross-examine her, and she knew he would try to rip her life apart. On the stand, under Eleanor's gentle questioning, Amelia recounted her life with Richard. The good times, the love, his excitement about their son. She did not cry. She spoke with a quiet, powerful dignity. Then Thorne approached, circling her like a shark. "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it true that you and your husband argued frequently in the last year?" "We had disagreements like any married couple. Disagreements about his work hours, about his friends. Isn't it true you told him he was becoming a self-obsessed caricature of himself during a fight just 2 months before he died?" Amelia paled. It was true. A private, painful moment was now a weapon against her. "I was upset. We were both under a lot of stress." "Stress? Or was the fairy tale ending?" Thorne pressed. "Isn't it true you were primarily concerned with the lifestyle he provided, the house, the cars, the status?" "No," Amelia said, her voice firm. "I was an architect with my own career when I met him. I loved my husband." "You loved him so much that when he died, your first act wasn't just to grieve, but to hire one of the most expensive lawyers in the state to sue for his money. Money he explicitly, in a legal document, left to another woman." "My first act," Amelia said, her voice rising with emotion as she looked directly at the jury, her hand on her belly, "was to survive. And when I found out that the man I loved had been convinced to sign away our child's future, my next act was to fight for my son. This isn't about greed. It's about a mother protecting her baby from being erased by the woman who destroyed our family." Her words hung in the silent courtroom. For the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt on the faces in the jury box. She had survived the attack. She had told her truth. Now all she could do was wait and pray that it was enough. The trial was drawing to a close. Both sides had presented their cases, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The prevailing wisdom among the legal pundits covering the case was that it was too close to call. Thorne had successfully planted seeds of doubt about Amelia's motives, while Eleanor had exposed the predatory side of Isabella. It all came down to which narrative the jury found more believable. Amelia felt like she was holding her breath, waiting for a verdict that would define the rest of her life. On the night before closing arguments, a frantic call came from Frank Miller, the private investigator. "I think I've got something big," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "It's a long shot, but you need to hear this. Remember the security software Isabella had Richard install at Nexus Dynamics, the one she recommended?" "Yes," Eleanor said, putting the call on speaker so Amelia could hear. "I've been digging into the company that makes it, a firm called Viridian Shield. It's a boutique cybersecurity outfit based in Delaware. I ran a deep corporate records search. Guess who is the primary silent investor behind the shell corporation that owns Viridian Shield?" There was a pause. "Don't tell me," Eleanor breathed. "Isabella Rossi." Frank confirmed. She funded its creation 3 years ago with the first big payout she got from Richard's investments. The software wasn't to protect him from competitors. It was to spy on him. It would have given her remote backdoor access to everything. His emails, his financial transactions, his calendar. Everything. Amelia felt a wave of nausea. The paranoia Richard had exhibited wasn't just in his head. It had been actively manufactured by the very person he trusted most. "Can you prove it?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with urgency. "I have the incorporation documents, but proving she used it to spy is harder. The software's logs would be on Nexus Dynamics' main server. We'd need a court order to access it, and the trial is ending tomorrow." "We don't have time for an order," Eleanor said, her mind racing. "But we don't need the logs. We just need the truth." The next morning, as Isabella Rossi took the stand for a final rebuttal testimony, looking poised and confident, Eleanor approached the lectern for her cross-examination. "Ms. Rossi," Eleanor began calmly, "you've testified that your relationship with Mr. Sterling was based on mutual trust and understanding, correct?" "That's right," Isabella said, smiling serenely. "We had no secrets." "No secrets. So you would have told him, of course, that you were the secret owner of Viridian Shield, the cybersecurity company whose software you insisted he install across his entire company." The question hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Marcus Thorne shot to his feet, shouting, "Objection, Relevance Foundation!" But it was too late. The damage was done. Isabella's serene mask dissolved into a look of pure, unadulterated panic. Her eyes darted toward Thorne, a silent plea for help. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice losing its carefully modulated calm. Eleanor walked towards the witness box, holding up a document. "This is the incorporation filing for the shell company that owns Viridian Shield, Ms. Rossi. The primary investor is listed under a trust that my investigator has traced directly back to a bank account in the Cayman Islands. An account that you opened 3 years ago. Would you like me to continue?" Thorne was frantically whispering to Isabella, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at Eleanor, her face a mixture of hatred and fear. The judge, intrigued, overruled Thorne's objection. "The witness will answer the question. Mr. Sterling's paranoia about corporate espionage. That wasn't real, was it, Ms. Rossi?" Eleanor pressed on, her voice like ice. "You stoked those fears. You created the problem so you could sell him your solution. A solution that gave you a backdoor into every aspect of his life. You didn't just influence him with words. You monitored his every move. You read his emails to his wife. You saw his business plans. You knew exactly which levers to pull. Isn't that right?" "No, that's a lie!" Isabella shrieked, her composure utterly shattered. "He wanted my help. He was losing his edge. He needed me." "He needed you, or you needed his password," Eleanor shot back. "The will, Ms. Rossi, was that his idea? Or did you just happen to see the draft of his old will on his computer and decide to help him revise it?" It was the final devastating blow. By revealing the spying, Eleanor hadn't just proven undue influence. She had exposed a level of cold, calculated manipulation that bordered on criminal. Isabella's credibility, so carefully constructed over weeks of testimony, had been annihilated in under 5 minutes. She was no longer the tragic soulmate. She was a spy who had bugged the man she claimed to love. Marcus Thorne knew the case was lost. His request for a redirect was limp, and Isabella's denials were hysterical and unconvincing. In her closing argument, Eleanor didn't need theatrics. She simply laid out the facts. "This was never a love affair," she told the jury. "It was a corporate takeover of a human being. And like any hostile takeover, the goal was a total acquisition of assets. Richard Sterling was not a lover to Isabella Rossi. He was her target, and his son, his unborn child, was just collateral damage in her ruthless pursuit of his fortune." As the jury filed out to deliberate, Amelia looked across the courtroom at Isabella. The beautiful, confident woman was gone. In her place was a pale, trembling figure, exposed and defeated. Amelia felt no triumph, only a profound and weary sadness for the man who had been so blind and for the life he had so carelessly thrown away. The battle was over. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. It was a lifetime. Amelia sat with Chloe and Eleanor in the sterile courthouse waiting room, unable to speak. Every possible outcome warred in her mind. What if they lost? What would she do? Where would she go? The life of her child hung in the balance, a thought so terrifying she had to physically push it away. When the bailiff called them back into the courtroom, the silence was absolute. Amelia's hand flew to her stomach, a protective shield. Isabella Rossi and Marcus Thorne were already at their table, Isabella looking ashen. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, stood and handed the verdict to the clerk. She refused to look at the defendant's table, a detail Eleanor noted with a tiny reassuring squeeze of Amelia's arm. The clerk cleared his throat and read from the paper. In the matter of the estate of Richard Sterling, on the challenge of the will dated February 12th, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff Amelia Hayes. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The clerk continued, "We find that the will is invalid due to proven undue influence exerted by the defendant, Ms. Isabella Rossi." Amelia broke. The dam of composure she had maintained for months burst, and silent hot tears streamed down her face. Chloe wrapped her arms around her, sobbing with relief. It was over. They had won. The court invalidated the new will, meaning the estate would revert to Richard's previous will, the one written after their wedding, which named Amelia as the sole beneficiary. Isabella Rossi simply stared into the middle distance, her expression blank, as if she couldn't process the words. Her empire, built on secrets and seduction, had crumbled to dust. The legal battle had not only cost her the Sterling fortune, but had exposed her past dealings, and the district attorney's office was already opening a fraud investigation against her and her company, Viridian Shield. 6 weeks later, Amelia gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. She did not name him Richard. She named him Christopher after her own father, a man of quiet integrity. It was a conscious decision to give her son a new legacy, one untainted by the scandal and secrets of his father. Life slowly found a new rhythm. The silence in the Beverly Hills mansion was no longer haunting. It was filled with the gurgles and cries of a newborn. Amelia, with the help of a reconstituted board of directors, led by a deeply remorseful David Chen, took control of Nexus Dynamics. She proved to be a natural leader, her architect's mind for structure and detail translating surprisingly well to the corporate world. She was not her husband. She was more cautious, more collaborative, and more ethical, and under her guidance the company stabilized and thrived. She never became the society queen Margaret Sterling had once hoped for. Instead, she became something far more formidable, a respected businesswoman and a devoted single mother. She sold the sprawling mansion, finding it too full of ghosts, and moved into a more modest but beautiful home in a quieter neighborhood. One of her first major acts as head of the estate was to establish the Sterling Foundation, but she changed its mission. Instead of funding the flashy art projects Richard had favored, she dedicated it to supporting single mothers and providing legal aid to women fighting unjust wills and predatory relationships. She took the ugliest chapter of her life and used its power to ensure other women would not have to fight the same battles alone. Years later, a journalist asked her if she ever forgave Richard. She paused, looking out the window of her office, a picture of a smiling, gap-toothed Christopher on her desk. "I have forgiven him for his weakness," she said finally. "I have forgiven him for being manipulated. But I don't think I'll ever forgive him for the choice he made for underestimating my strength and for almost making our son pay the price. He left his fortune to the wrong woman. I'm just the one who had to prove it. She had inherited more than Richard's money. She had inherited his power, and she was determined to wield it with the wisdom and compassion he had so tragically lacked. Her fight was over, but her true legacy and Christopher's was just beginning." Amelia Hayes' story is a harrowing yet ultimately inspiring testament to a mother's resilience. It's a reminder that a person's true character isn't revealed when life is easy, but when they are stripped of everything and forced to fight for what matters most. She faced down grief, betrayal, and a hostile legal system, not for money, but for her child's right to exist. Her victory wasn't just in a courtroom. It was in rewriting her own future and turning her pain into a shield for others. What do you think was Amelia's fight about justice or revenge? What would you have done in her position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of strength and survival moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear a story of triumph over adversity. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that need to be told. Thank you for watching.